and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, US President Donald Trump says that Hamas should release all hostages being held in Gaza by Saturday. The alternative, he said, is cancelling the ceasefire and letting, quote, hell break out. Jordan's King Abdullah II meets the US President Donald Trump in Washington. Their talks follow President Trump's suggestion that people from Gaza be resettled in either Jordan or Egypt. And as the UK's new ambassador to Washington, Lord Peter Mandleson, takes up his new job, he backtracks on comments he made about the US President Donald Trump 5 years ago. Hello and welcome to the programme. The Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal in Gaza is looking more fragile than ever. This after the US President Donald Trump issued an ultimatum: release all the Israeli hostages still being held in Gaza or, quote, let all hell break loose. Well, he also warned that the truce could be cancelled. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Well, I would say this, and I'm going to let that be because that's Israel's decision, but as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out. And I don't think they're going to do it. I think a lot of them are dead.
Well, President Trump's comments came after Hamas suspended the release of Israeli hostages over ceasefire violations, and that prompted Israel's defense minister to put the military on high alert. Well, mediators now fear the collapse of the 3-week-old ceasefire deal. Well, for more analysis, we can cross the Jerusalem and speak to reporter Noga Tarnopolsky. Noga, great to have you with us again. Obviously, the war has been paused since the middle of January. Is there now a feeling that the ceasefire deal is in serious jeopardy?
There is. I have to say, here in Israel, there's a growing feeling that the ceasefire deal could be in jeopardy. And there is something close to terror among a significant proportion of the population about what that will mean for the fate of the hostages, the Israeli hostages who remain in the hands of Hamas. The Israeli cabinet just finished a 4.5-hour meeting. And while we haven't heard anything official, we do know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is expected to make a videotaped statement any minute now. And following on to several days of Netanyahu's ministers pretty intensively saying they would not vote for a phase 2, which phase 2 was supposed to bring the end of the war, the release of all remaining hostages, living and dead, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. It appears that the Israeli government is about to make a kind of pretty dramatic U-turn. And instead of relating directly to the terms of the ceasefire agreement, what we're hearing, and I have to emphasize, it's just what I've been hearing here for the last half hour or so, is that Israel is going to announce that it is adopting Donald Trump's terms, which are very different than the terms of this internationally signed agreement. The agreement was created also by Donald Trump's team. So this is a bit of an astonishing turn, but that's what we're expecting to hear from the Israeli Prime Minister in the coming few minutes.
Right, and of course, President Donald Trump's terms are, he's threatening, quote, to let hell break out if the hostages aren't all released by the weekend, midday on Saturday, to be precise. I mean, do people in Israel agree with that? Do you think a majority of Israeli people think that's the right way to go?
It's kind of impossible to know what all Israelis might think of something that hasn't even been announced. But I do know, I can absolutely tell you that Israelis are terrified and horrified by the idea that hostages, some of whom are dead, one of whom was announced dead today, some of whom are being held in inhuman conditions that their families have heard about just in the recent weeks as the other hostages were released and were able to report on who they had seen or what they knew. Some families here have gotten a much clearer picture. The family, for example, of a young man called Alon Ohel, whose 24th birthday was yesterday. He's known to be kept in chains underground. He has not seen the light of day since October 2023, and he has shrapnel wounds that are untreated all over, including in one of his eyes. So that's the extent of the details that Israelis have heard, and there is profound fear. I really can't underscore it enough that something may happen, a Trump statement, a government decision. There's tremendous fear that something will happen that will jeopardize the lives of the hostages who still remain there.
Yeah, and this use of the word letting hell break loose, or words to that effect, we've heard that from President Trump before. In fact, we heard it on the campaign trail as a threat that some sort of a ceasefire need to be in place by the time he was inaugurated. A lot of people we've spoken to who've been reporting on the ground in Gaza say a threat like that really won't chime with people in Gaza, because they would say, we've already experienced 16 months of hell. I mean, what more could President Trump and the Israeli army do? What could be the next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that feeling completely. That said, we should be careful because things can always get worse in different ways. I'll give you an example from today. Donald Trump's threats to somehow force the hand of Jordan and of Egypt to accept the residents of Gaza, of a Gaza that would be emptied of its population, have brought the Egyptian government today to say that if Donald Trump continues on this route, this would obviate the Oslo agreements. The Camp David agreements, forgive me. The Camp David agreements were the first agreement, a historic document made with American mediation during the Carter presidency. It was the first peace accord between an Arab nation and the state of Israel. This accord, while sometimes warmer and sometimes chillier, this accord has saved untold thousands of lives. From the signing of that accord, there were no more wars and no more killing on the Israeli-Egyptian border, which had been one of the worst, one of the most bloody since the establishment of the State of Israel. And so we're talking right now about risks, certainly risks to the hostages, risks to the social fabric of the State of Israel, risks to Gazans, but we're also talking about I think the visible threat of a kind of shredding of the fabric of this region, which could still, I have to say, get quite a bit worse.
And also potentially damaging for President Donald Trump politically, domestically, but also damaging for America's standing on the world stage. I mean, do you think there's some truth to that?
Yeah, I think it could be very damaging. I'm not sure that what you and I consider damaging is something that impacts President Trump. I'm not, I have no way of knowing what passes through his head. But even in the short period of time since he's returned to the presidency, in my part of the world, we've had a lot of ups and downs. Initially, what we heard really on the day of the inauguration was that his new Middle Eastern envoy, Steve Witkoff, had basically read the riot act to Prime Minister Netanyahu using obscenities and said, "You get this deal done." And so the majority of Israelis who want the hostages back, who are absolutely ready for the war to be over, thought, oh my goodness, President Trump is the one who's going to get us what our government has shied away from for months. Remember that the agreement that was finally realized as of January 19th is the same agreement. The Israeli government says it. It's the same agreement that was on the table at the end of May. And many, many lives have been lost since then. So that started. Then Donald Trump began talking about personally owning Gaza and turning it into a Riviera. In Israel, there was a lot of amusement about this. Prime Minister Netanyahu has boasted about this as a historic achievement for Israel. And now we're seeing the very scary reality that statements by this American president have impact on the region that could radically change reality It could possibly for the better, but certainly also for the worse. And the people who are going to pay the price are Jews and Arabs in this region.
I mean, just to help us understand and help our viewers understand, Noga, how we've reached this point. I mean, the ceasefire, took months of negotiations. In recent days and weeks, we've had Hamas and Israel accusing each other of violating the terms of that ceasefire. I mean, what specifically has made things unravel to this extent, do you think?
We could discuss this for an hour, but to keep it brief, both Hamas and the Israeli government had doubts about this agreement. And that's the reason that while it was on the table as of May, neither really jumped at it and agreed to enact it. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, the threat is losing power, because if he agrees to the end of the war, a formal end of the war, and by definition, he would be agreeing to an end of the war while Hamas still exists, because Hamas is who Israel's negotiating with. So that would very much risk his hold on power. Several of his ministers have said, we're not going to vote for that, full stop. And in fact, his Minister for National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, quit before, instead of voting on the first phase of the deal. But there are many more ministers now threatening to jump ship. And we've seen over the past year and a half now, almost year and 5 months, that Prime Minister Netanyahu safeguards his own coalition. He views the stability of his own governing coalition as an equivalent to the stability of the country, whatever may be happening on the streets. In terms of Gaza, Hamas has been basically militarily defeated, and its ability to administer Gaza would have been eliminated if Israel and the other interested parties had been able to agree to an alternative force. If Israel had at any point said, we accept X, the Palestinian Authority, as was demanded of it by the international community, or any other realistic option, who could have come in to Gaza and taken over power. So it's Israel's refusal to actually name any body that it would agree to allow to administer Gaza that has left Hamas in this kind of nominally administrative position, which gives it a lot more strength than it has in any other respect. And that's the reason we've come, both sides trying to cling on to power. That's how we've come to this point.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Really interesting. Noga Tarnopolsky, thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, staying with Gaza, we've had more comments from President Trump during the last 24 hours, which have sparked another degree of global alarm. Well, in a Fox News interview, the president stated that the Palestinians will not have the right to return to the war-torn Gaza Strip under his takeover plan. Well, President Trump also reiterated that the US would own Gaza, describing it as a real estate development for the future.
We'll build beautiful communities for the 1.9 million people. We'll build beautiful communities, safe communities. Could be 5, 6, could be 2, but we'll build safe communities a little bit away from where they are, where all of this danger is. In the meantime, I would own this. Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful pice of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing, much better. In other words, I'm talking about building a permanent place for them, because if they have to return now, it'll be years before you could ever. It's not habitable. It will be years before it could happen. I'm talking about starting to build, and I think I could make a deal with Jordan. I think I could make a deal with Egypt. You know, we give them billions and billions of dollars a year.
President Trump speaking there to Fox News. Well, the president also said that he wants to relocate Palestinians from Gaza to neighboring Jordan and Egypt. He also mentioned plans to build 6 new sites outside of the Gaza Strip for people to live in. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Anne Irfan, a historian and academic on the modern Middle East, Palestinian refugee rights and colonial displacements at University College London. Dr. Irfan, you're also the author of Refuge and Resistance, Palestinians and the International Refugee System. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. On Monday, President Trump said, and we just had a clip of it there, that the Palestinians who left Gaza would have no right of return after leaving. What do you make of all of this?
Well, it's unfortunately unsurprising. It's consistent with what we've been hearing from Trump in general, not only in the last 3 weeks, but to be honest, over the entirety of his political career during his first term as well, which is erasure of the Palestinian people as a political community with national rights, denial of the fact that those rights are enshrined in international law. And last week, we heard him talk openly about plans to ethnically cleanse Gaza, to force out the 2 million Palestinians there. And now he has essentially moved to the next stage of that by saying openly that they won't be allowed to return. It's worth keeping in mind, of course, that the state of Israel has denied the Palestinian people their right of return for the last 76 years. So although this is prompting new levels of alarm, it is to some degree an intensification of a longer-term policy.
I mean, does all of this sound to you like there is a carefully considered master plan, or do you get the impression that President Trump is trying out various theories, various solutions, and sort of venting them and seeing what the reaction's like?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that whether or not Trump is being serious when he says this, there is a very long history of different plans and moves being made to try and expel the Palestinians en masse from Gaza in particular and Palestine in general. And even in what he said last week, when Trump talked last week about it, he euphemistically talked about, relocating the Palestinians, essentially expelling them. That already engenders and emboldens a whole pre-existing set of discourses and plans that have been around in Israel for a long time about forcibly taking the Gaza Strip. So I think we need to be careful of focusing too much on the question of whether or not Trump has a plan, and we need to keep in mind the fact that whether or not he has a plan, these plans do exist. And in putting this kind of rhetoric and discourse out there, what Trump is doing is giving a new level of international supposed legitimacy to those plans.
And at the same time, potentially damaging the stability of what is a very fragile region, isn't it?
Absolutely, there is no scenario in which the expulsion of more than 2 million people from their homes is going to cause anything but further crisis and instability. But it's also important that we keep in mind that around 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza are already refugees. The majority of the Palestinian people were displaced and expelled from their homes in 1948. So we're not talking about a singular act of displacement or transfer here. We're talking about a long-term repeated condition that has been imposed on the Palestinian people, starting with their original dispossession in 1948.
I mean, have you ever seen the situation in the region looking as precarious as perhaps it does right now?
The situation in the region now, particularly in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, it's also worsening across the West Bank and further afield, is absolutely at alarming levels of what we could barely even refer to as a crisis anymore. We're really talking now about a chronic state of catastrophe. And the refusal of the world powers, particularly the US, to recognize that is deeply alarming. The fact that the Trump administration, in alliance with the Netanyahu government, are insisting on treating the Gaza Strip as a business opportunity rather than a humanitarian and political catastrophe is deeply alarming, actually, not only for the Middle East, but in terms of the bigger international precedents that it's establishing and that people around the world are observing.
Yeah, so, I mean, on the one hand, you've got Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump singing more or less from the same song sheet. But then you've also got all the regional leaders singing from another song sheet. And they don't seem to be shifting an inch in terms of what they're saying. I mean, what do you read into the messaging of regional leaders in the Arab world in particular?
For any Arab leader to be complicit in the loss of further Palestinian land, in further Palestinian expulsion, transfer, displacement, is really unthinkable. It would be absolutely a smear would be as an understatement of what it would do to any Arab leaders standing amongst their own people and amongst the Arab world. We've seen continuously over the years that the Palestine cause remains very powerful on the Arab street, and the leaders know that.
I mean, we were speaking yesterday to a former US Middle East negotiator, Aaron David Miller, who said to us that the two-state solution had been on life support for 20 years and that President Trump might preside over its burial. What do you make of that? Do you think that's the case?
I think anyone who's been paying attention knows that the two-state solution, quote unquote, died long ago, starting with the fact that from the very beginning of the Oslo process, Israel continued to build settlements and to take more land while claiming it was working towards a two-state solution. There has not been a viable two-state solution for many years now. There is a one-state reality with an apartheid system that is widely recognized, not only by internationally, but actually increasingly within Israel itself. And it's only really been a farcical reality, a farcical illusion by certain Western leaders to claim that the two-state solution has existed at all. What we have is a one-state reality, and what many people have been fighting for is equality and justice within that one-state reality.
Oh, and what do you think this means for people in the West Bank who must have, obviously everyone's been watching what's been happening in Gaza, but it does seem that the situation in the West Bank is getting increasingly tense. I mean, how do you see events unfolding there?
Yeah, absolutely. The situation in the West Bank has been worsening since October 2023. And in fact, even prior to October, 2023 was the most violent year for the Palestinians since the Second Intifada. More Palestinians were killed in the first 9 months of 2023 than in any previous year since the Second Intifada. And since October, obviously October the 7th, 2023, and everything since then, it's only got much worse for Palestinians in the West Bank. We are seeing now increasing suggestions that Israel is going to formalize what has long been a kind of, de facto annexation of the West Bank. We are seeing increasing openly state support for settler vigilante armed groups, attacks on Palestinian civilians across the West Bank by both soldiers and settlers, as the Israeli state is simultaneously taking advantage of the world being focused on Gaza, and also taking advantage of how it's been emboldened by various global actors' inaction over Gaza to essentially escalate its violence in the West Bank.
In a moment, we're going to be talking about the visit to Washington by the King of Jordan, King Abdullah II. And I'm just wondering whether you anticipate President Donald Trump perhaps having a bit of a rethink, having spoken to other Arab regional leaders and not just the Israeli Prime Minister. Do you see that happening?
Well, Trump is obviously something of a mercurial figure, so it's always difficult to predict exactly what he's going to do. But as you said earlier, regional leaders, including US allies, including the Saudi regime, have been very explicit in their opposition to this plan. The question probably remains as to what we're going to see both Trump and the Arab leaders actually do in action, either to make it happen or to stop it from happening.
How important would you say the King of Jordan's role is in all of this potentially?
It's potentially quite significant. Jordan has a very significant Palestinian population. It has an important historical and political role. It also has a formally recognized role in parts of Jerusalem. There is an older tradition that Trump is trying to resurrect of expelling the Palestinian people to Jordan. He seems to be flitting between Jordan and Egypt as options at the moment. And once again, as I said earlier, Abdullah will be well aware of the salience of the Palestine cause to Arab people everywhere, and the fact that he cannot be complicit in the displacement, expulsion, and seizure of Palestinian land.
But he's in a really difficult situation because every year Jordan receives something like $750 million in economic assistance from Washington, 350 million in military aid, all of that really important to maintaining stability in the country, and that's something that it prides itself on. I mean, could that as a tool be sufficient to bring the King of Jordan on side with President Donald Trump and have him see the situation through the same prism as him?
It's worth turning that on its head for a minute and also considering why it is that the US spends so much money on ensuring the quote-unquote stability of the Jordanian regime. And a big part of that is because the Jordanian regime is seen, as you put it, as stabilizer, and it's also seen as essentially, to some degree, helping the Israeli government in its promotion of stability too. So although, of course, it is an unequal relationship, the Jordanian regime is not entirely without leverage in these negotiations either. Neither Israel nor the US would want the Jordanian regime to completely go rogue on this.
Okay, and just lastly, Dr. Irfan, do you think we're looking at the moment at a situation comparable to what we saw happen in 1948 with regards to the Palestinian people?
Unfortunately, in terms of sheer numbers, what we've seen is far worse already than 1948. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians at least were expelled and displaced from their homes. Since October 2023, we've seen close to 2 million Palestinians in Gaza expelled and displaced from their homes. We also have seen a death toll that is at least in excess of 60,000, but according to some estimates, might be more than twice as much as that. So unfortunately, we are far worse than that already.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Dr. Anne Irfan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Jordan's King Abdullah II is today meeting with US President Donald Trump in Washington. Well, their talks follow on from President Trump's suggestion that the Palestinian people be moved from Gaza and resettled in either of Jordan or Egypt. Well, that proposal has been flatly rejected by both countries and by the Palestinians. Well, King Abdullah is the first Arab leader to meet with President Trump since his return to office. Well, for Jordan, this is a delicate situation. While a key US ally, the country is also home to millions of Palestinian refugees. Well, President Trump has threatened to leverage the nearly $1.5 billion in annual US aid to Jordan to force Amman into accepting his Gaza plan. Well, for more, we can speak now to Mick Mulroy, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. The King of Jordan, of course, meeting President Trump today. I mean, would you say these two men, judging based on previous experience, are two men that see eye to eye?
Generally speaking, yes. The U.S. has a very close relationship with Jordan, particularly on the counterterrorism challenge that we've had over 20 years. The U.S. has a lot of forces that are stationed in Jordan. It is a very close relationship, but I agree with your introduction that it's pretty tense right now because what President Trump proposed was a forcible relocation of almost 2 million Palestinians from Gaza into two countries, Egypt and Jordan, that have expressed that they will not take them. So this is going to be certainly the most controversial part of this meeting. And if President Trump holds true on his promise to withhold the $1.4 billion that we provide to the kingdom every year, that will put a serious challenge on his hold, quite frankly, and his authority in his country. This could really destabilize Jordan, something that the United States has sought to avoid for many, many years.
Yeah, how do you think the leadership in Jordan and the people of Jordan feel about how they've been treated by the Trump administration, which is, let's face it, only 3 weeks old?
So as you referenced, it's about 50% of the population in Jordan is of Palestinian descent. So they have a very close tie, obviously, to what's going on in the West Bank and in Gaza. And if this is viewed, and it would be viewed as a forcible relocation of a population from their homeland, which is, by my understanding, unlawful under international law, they're going to have serious protests on their hands in Jordan. And certainly, if he agrees to accept these individuals from Gaza, which would essentially end the chance of Gaza being part of any future Palestinian state, that would be almost catastrophic in the view of the Palestinians that live in Jordan. So this is a very tense situation for King Abdullah, and hopefully there can be some kind of compromise to move forward without really risking the stabilization of Jordan and keeping them as a close ally of the United States, which is mutually beneficial to both countries.
Okay, so in terms of his top priorities on this visit, what do you interpret as being the likely key issues that the king has to try and deliver on?
So I think the king, of course, was really coming originally to talk about the ceasefire and how we go from phase one, which we're in now, but that's being challenged by Hamas' apparent refusal to release hostages on Saturday. But I believe the king's going to want to talk about, okay, how do we get into the second phase, third phase? How do we have a diplomatic path toward a two-state solution? How do we rebuild and reconstruct Gaza? These are all things that essentially do fit into what President Trump laid out, but it's just in a different manner. It's done in a peaceful way without the relocation of Palestinians. I think the king is going to try to get the conversation more on track of where the negotiations were going, which would allow Palestinians, of course, to stay in their homeland, to get to a peaceful solution, to get a new governing body in Gaza that does not have it on their agenda to attack their neighbor in Israel, that they can actually trust the security that's in Gaza, and that there is a diplomatic path toward an eventual two-state solution, which will also be necessary, of course, if there's any real progress on the Saudi-Israel relationship and how they can get to normalization. All those things have to happen, really, to see that going to a conclusion.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little earlier in the program, but I just want to get your perspective. Does it look to you like the ceasefire in Gaza is going to hold, or would you say it's in jeopardy?
I do think it's in jeopardy. Hamas clarified their statement that they would not provide the hostages out as required on Saturday, with the idea that Israel could still make up for the deficiencies as seen by Hamas in delivering humanitarian aid and allowing people to return to the north. I don't know if Israel's not doing that. That's what Hamas said. But certainly there is, I think, some wiggle room here in their statement that we could still see the hostages come out as expected and agreed upon in the ceasefire. So 3, not the entirety. Of course, we'd all like to see all the hostages come out. But in the agreement, it would be 3 on Saturday. If that happens, then hopefully this agreement continues forward and we can eventually get into the second phase negotiations, which apparently have not started yet.
Okay, we are talking here, aren't we, with regards to these talks between President Trump and King Abdullah about 2 key allies holding talks, aren't we? I mean, how important an ally would you say Jordan is to Washington?
Very. I mean, they have been critical, like I mentioned, in our global war against terror, both their abilities, they deployed forces to combat zones that we are in. They've housed our forces on their territory. And it's really been a very close relationship. The Central Command, which is the command that is responsible for the U.S. military in the Middle East and in parts of Asia, really has a footprint there that is not replaceable, certainly not easily replaceable. And I think the relationship from the United States perspective is very strong and important. And from the Jordanian perspective, we obviously provide them a lot of support, but we also provide them a lot of security. I mean, the one benefit that countries get for having a lot of U.S. military forces is some level of security, as we are there and we will defend ourselves and, of course, the country where we're in. So it is a mutually beneficial, I think, relationship between the two countries, and hopefully this will continue past this meeting today.
Yeah, and of course, Jordan, which houses these US military bases, I mean, is doing an important service for the United States in the region. I mean, how likely is it that Donald Trump would pull the plug on military aid and other kinds of aid in the event he doesn't get his way with this Gaza deal? I mean, it would be extremely grave for the United States as well, wouldn't it?
Well, I think if, quite frankly, if we were in the first administration, there'd be a very slim chance. But I think, as you mentioned, we're 3 weeks into the second administration, and we've seen some things that are much more aggressive than we saw in the first, including, the dismantling of USAID, for an example. So I think that there is a possibility that he could withhold this funding. And then, of course, there's also Egypt. Egypt is the other country, and quite frankly, probably easier to relocate people from Gaza. They also receive a significant amount, a little more than what Jordan does from the United States every year, and he's already threatened to withhold that. So I think that is a real possibility. Yes, it might be bluster. It might be to kind of shock the system so that the U.S. has some kind of upper hand in the negotiations. That's potential. I've certainly seen people speculate on that. But if it is actually something that could happen, it could have a significant effect on U.S. national security and our relationships to key allies, in this case, Egypt and Jordan in the region. And of course, if it actually plays out, then I think it'll significantly affect our relationship, the U.S.'s relationship with many of our Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, when it comes to this actually being carried out.
Yeah, I mean, all of the countries you mentioned, in particular Jordan and Egypt, which are the countries that have been singled out for these relocated or displaced Palestinians by President Trump. I mean, the Arab League, all the nations you mentioned, are pretty resolute, aren't they? There aren't any cracks visible in terms of their resolve and their opinion on this. And I'm just wondering whether President Trump is setting himself up for a kind of an unnecessary impasse here.
He could be. I think you're right. I think they were very clear. There was no, from their statements, it was clear that there was no option in this regard, particularly Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is the country, quite frankly, that would be the most helpful, likely, when it comes to resources to reconstruct Gaza. They're the country that the Trump administration would rightly want to see enter what they're calling this grand bargain to normalize relationship with Israel, therefore expanding the Abraham Accords, which were a success in the first Trump administration. So this idea, although it could end up in the same place as far as a reconstructed Gaza, with the plan that the ceasefire is, of course, with Palestinians in it. That's the difference, of course, and not under the ownership, which I'm not sure how that would even be the case, of the United States. So there is, I think, a way that our Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia certainly in the lead, would view the path ahead for the Palestinian people, which would, of course, include a Palestinian state. And then there's this new view that President Trump laid out, which would be one without, at least for Gaza, without Palestinians and somehow a territory of the United States, at least from his statements. Those are two entirely different paths. I don't see any support internationally for the President Trump proposal, except for maybe a small element of the right side of the political spectrum in Israel, but certainly not with the Gulf allies, and certainly not with the two countries where Palestinians would be housed under this concept.
And in terms of the message that King Abdullah has brought with him to Washington, saying that displacing the people of Gaza will, quote, spur radicalism, spread chaos in the region, jeopardize peace with Israel, threaten Jordan's very survival. I mean, pretty strong messages. I mean, do you think they're likely to get through to President Trump? And do you think President Trump, now having heard it, face to face from another leader in the region, apart from Prime Minister Netanyahu, perhaps he might change his mind?
Yes, and I do believe President Trump and King Abdullah have a good relationship, and I think there's a lot of mutual respect there. So I think if he says it, in addition to what I would guess, his national security advisor is a very capable, intelligent advisor, and I think he knows the consequences, and I think he's also telling President Trump that. So Mike Waltz, I think Secretary Rubio also very well aware, having served on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence for many years, knows of the threat that could be coming if the region is destabilized and the jihadist threat goes up substantially. And of course, there is treaties with Jordan, there's treaties with Egypt between Israel. And this is something that could be challenged as well. We could backtrack decades and decades of agreements that have caused stabilization in the region, and this could upend many of those things. Don't know if they'll all happen, but if any of it happens, it would not be good for the interests of the United States and certainly the countries in the region.
Yeah, and use a key word there, stabilization. I was about to say, I mean, Jordan is a country that prides itself on its stability. And that's, again, going to be part of that package of messages, isn't it, that King Abdullah is presenting to President Trump, saying, you know, our stability could very well be in jeopardy if the demographic, the equilibrium of our country is tipped any further than it already has been.
Yes, and that's something the U.S. has been concerned about for many administrations, is to ensure the stability of Jordan, partly because, of course, we do have forces there, but also because King Abdullah has been a staunch ally of the United States in the war against terrorism. It's obviously in his interest as well. So that is a key national security priority for the United States, is to ensure the stability of Jordan and Egypt, for that matter. These are all partners, longtime partners of the United States, and their stability is our stability. So I think that will be presented to President Trump today, both by his team and by the King of Jordan. And hopefully we can work a way out of this current loggerhead, if you will, so that there is a path that does right by the Palestinian people, does right by the Israeli people and their security, and starts working toward a path of reconstruction and a future in which Hamas will have no play in the governing of Gaza.
Okay, just to wrap up, Mick, I mean, fair to say the stakes for King Abdullah are pretty high, aren't they?
Yes, this is a very meaningful meeting that we're going to see today. I think all of these meetings have a potential to have significance, but this one is going into it. And today we'll see a meeting that has serious consequences.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Mick Mulroy, always a pleasure. And finally, the United Kingdom has a new ambassador to Washington. That man is Lord Peter Mandleson. Well, the 71-year-old Labour Party grandee presented his credentials at the State Department on Monday. Well, Mandelson's run-up to the job hasn't been without controversy. Back in December, a close ally of President Donald Trump reacted angrily to the news of Mandelson's appointment, calling him, quote, an absolute moron. Well, the reason being, 5 years earlier, Lord Mandleson had described President Trump as a danger to the world and, quote, little short of a white nationalist. Well, let's find out more now about how the new British ambassador to Washington is walking this diplomatic tightrope. We can speak to Denis Macshane, former Labour MP and Minister of State for Europe, and a friend and former colleague of Lord Mandleson. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Lord Mandleson began his role officially on Monday. And just to be clear for our audience, barring Foreign Secretary, this is about the most prestigious role in the British diplomatic hierarchy, isn't it?
Pretty much so, yep. A very ambassador to the United States. It's always gone to the superstars. I think the last Lord to do it was a man called Lord Halifax, who served in the cabinet during the before the Second World War, and then went to be ambassador in the United States. Churchill didn't like him, so got rid of him to America. Everybody, well, I'm sure Sir Keir Starmer likes Peter. I do. Many people do. Some don't. But it's a role for a very big heavyweight politician. And on any weighing scale, Peter Mandleson has been one of our heaviest of heavyweight politicians on the Labour side here for the last 30 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, just tell us a little bit more about him and who he is, because for an international audience, perhaps people won't all remember back to the days of the Blair government. Just tell us who he is and also how significant he was in that Blair government.
It's pretty simple. Peter, like most big politicians, starts doing politics pretty fast after Oxford. He's a natural leader. He was chairman of the British Youth Organisation, which was a big movement then, in his 20s. He becomes director of communications for the Labour Party, aged 35, an MP a few years later. And then he's into the Blair government when it comes in 1997. And in that period, 1980s, 1990s, he's giving first-rate strategic advice to Labour leaders, Neil Kinnock, John Smith, and Tony Blair, and also very cute, smart, tactical advice. Tony Blair said that if nuclear war was declared on Britain, Peter would send me a one-page memo and it would sum it all up and what we should do. And I said, okay, that's a joke, but nonetheless, he is very, very shrewd. Perhaps at times he needs someone to give himself advice. But the other big advantage in Washington right now is he's the first ambassador of that rank with real trade negotiating experience, because he was a European commissioner for trade. So believe me, there'll be nobody in Washington who's got quite that level of professional trade negotiation experience as Peter Mandleson.
Right, so you're beginning to give me some clues as to why this job, British ambassador to Washington, has gone to a political appointee and not a career diplomat, in particular to Lord Mandleson. Sounds like he brings plenty to the table, and at quite a delicate moment, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, indeed. But I think he'll fit in well with the Trump-Musk scene, in the sense that he is larger than life. He's very theatrical. He's an immense charmer. He'll size up Donald Trump very fast and align himself, at least in conversation. He has to represent British government policy, of course. And I'm sure make the president, if he sees him, ambassadors don't really regularly see the president of the United States unless the king arrives or the prime minister, and the same for all countries. But if he's in contact with Donald Trump, he'll say something that's sort of quite witty, a little bit sort of sly, quite cool, that I expect Mr. Trump will remember. And, I don't think Trump really knows much who he was. And if Donald Trump worried about everybody who'd said something nasty about him in the last 20 years, he'd be a shaking wreck. And that's one thing he isn't at the moment, is he?
Yes, but I think he does remember those words. Certainly some people close to President Trump remember those words from 2019 when Lord Mandleson called him little short of a white nationalist and a racist. I mean, very hard to walk back on those comments. I heard him having a go at it. How do you rate his success in walking that back?
Listen, I'm talking to you from the European Union. You want me to list the leaders of the European Union, individual presidents, European Commission people, other British politicians? Boris Johnson called Donald Trump a man wholly unfit to hold the office of President of the United States. And Boris Johnson is meant to be on the Trump wavelength and a fan and a follower of Donald Trump. I'm afraid Mr. Trump has attracted lots and lots of very, very fruity comments in his career, especially in the last, decade and a half or so, as he's aimed for high political office. And if he really spends 1 nanosecond worrying about them, he'll never be able to do his job. So I wouldn't worry about that. The real question will be British tariffs on Great Britain, other questions about Ukraine, where Britain really wants and is one of the leading countries in Europe in saying to Mr. Putin, back off, withdraw, give up, stop this insane criminal war on the European continent. And I think Britain will stick strongly to that position, and it's one of the leaders in Europe, whereas there's some indication that some people in Mr. Trump's circles want to appease Mr. Putin and draw stumps on Ukraine. I'm not sure that metaphor will be understood in the White House, but in other words, leave Mr. Putin as the winner. So that will be a very tricky thing for Peter Mandleson as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to need thick skin, isn't he? Because before he arrived, he was being called, quote, an absolute moron by a Trump aide. I mean, that's not an easy thing to hear, not a very welcoming pair of words there. I mean, does he have the thick skin he's going to need to brush off comments like that?
I heard at a meeting of all the Labour MPs early on in the Blair government, a left-wing guy, a nice guy, intelligent guy, stand up and say to Tony Blair and Peter Mandleson and all the other MPs, well, we've all been reading the book just written by Peter Mandleson about what Labour should do. It's like taking the railroad across Canada, miles and miles of nothing. Now, if Peter could laugh that off face to face in front of Tony Blair from someone, I rather expect that some unknown minor functionary, because trouble with journalists, they can always find somebody to say something nasty about a top flight politician. It's part of the trade. And Peter, believe me, is not thin skinned.
Well, it wasn't hard to find. The comment was on Twitter and put out there, and it did attract a certain amount of attention. But there is another shadow lingering over this appointment, and I'm wondering whether you think Lord Mandleson is going to be feeling it. And I'm talking about Nigel Farage, who, again, for the benefit of our audience, who might not all know, he is the leader of the UK Reform Party. And Donald Trump made it known in the past that he was, you know, his kind of guy and the sort of person he would like to see as British ambassador to Washington. I mean, difficult, do you think, for Lord Mandleson to know he wasn't perhaps the first choice of ambassador for the host country?
It's not up to a host country to decide who is sent to them as an ambassador. That's the choice, if you want to be very pompous about it, of the king or the queen in Britain, the president of France. It's not the host country who selects the ambassador. I wrote an article at the time. I can't put it up on the screen. And of course, the only source for the story that Donald Trump wanted Nigel Farage to be the ambassador was indeed dear old Nigel himself. I mean, if there's one man who promotes himself even more than Peter Mandleson, it's Nigel Farage. But I think in the eyes of Donald Trump, he clearly knows who Nigel Farage is. He's met him in the past, especially when after the Brexit referendum, because Mr. Trump is pretty anti-European Union. We know that. But Mr. Trump, above all, respects success. Nigel Farage has been trying now for 30 years to become a power in British politics. In the last election, he got himself and just 4 other rather odd fruitcake right-wingers elected as MPs. It's got a grand name, Reform Party, but it's just a bunch of eccentrics. So Keir Starmer got over 400, one of the biggest election victories for a single party in British political and parliamentary history. Now, as I say, Donald Trump isn't Keir Starmer's cup of tea, but he said very nice things about him since they met and since they had conversations. And I think Mr. Trump respects success. Peter Mandleson is very, very good on the job he does, media, strategic politics. Nigel Farage is very, very good at self-publicity, but as a politician who's actually won power, won seats, got close to the centre of power, I'm afraid Nigel, bless him, isn't also ran, whereas Mr. Trump has been in the White House 2 times. Well, nevertheless, reform continues to attract millions of votes and is doing pretty well in the polls. Just want to ask you about something different, though. I mean, we were talking at the beginning about how prestigious this job is as, you know, Britain's perhaps most prestigious diplomat outside of London. The house that he'll be living in, that in itself is a tool, isn't it, of British soft power in the United States. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, but just tell us why that might be the case. Oh, sure. I stayed in there several times. It's a Lutyens house. It's a very famous British architecture of the high camp imperial era. He built the great Viceroy's Palace in New Delhi at the time when India was sort of part of the British Empire, and the Indians all had to bow and scrape to their white masters. You go there, and it's like a sort of pantomime set. It's something like out of Gilbert and Sullivan. It's extraordinary. And the house on Mass Ave, also next door to the Vice President's mansion, or maybe that's the embassy. The embassy is a rather dull building, but it's a great building. You sweep in. I don't know if you've seen that Netflix series, The Diplomat, but it conveys some of it. And I'm sure Peter will be a host extraordinaire. I think you'll find he'll start giving the best parties, inviting the cutest people from all walks of American life, and that people will want to be seen with. As I say, it's unusual for a president to interface directly with an ambassador, any ambassador, but I expect the British Embassy in Washington now is going to be the go-to place for the parties, the swish dinners, the receptions, the artists, the writers, the intellectuals, and all the power players in Team Trump. All right, and just to wrap up, sounds to me like you think
what's often called the special relationship between London and Washington is alive and well and is in safe hands with Lord Mandleson in that residence in Washington?
I never use that phrase. I keep hearing it here. I used to hear prime ministers use it and politicians use it. I worked in America. I was the minister representing Britain to the United States, and I was there in the State Department, principally, obviously, as a Foreign Office minister. But I knew Bill Clinton. I long talked with Joe Biden, with sort of similar political backgrounds to begin with, and got on with them very well. And President Bush was always a very polite person. I never heard an American president talk about the special relationship. It's a sort of English obsession, but there is no doubt, for all the historical reasons we know. I mean, America, after all, is an offshoot of England. It's the same language. It's fighting in 2 world wars to defeat nationalist right-wing politicians, German Kaisers and Hitler, big right-wing politician in 2 world wars. And sharing a lot of ideas and intellectual ideas and what a university should be. So, yeah, it's a pretty good connection. But Trump is going to steer his own course. Mr. Trump will steer his own course. His mother comes from the Western Isles of Scotland, and he bought her a small what the Scots call a croft. We would call it a cottage up there, and she used to go back for 2 or 3 months a year and meet old friends. And she's very popular, well liked on the Western Isles. So Mr. Trump's got that connection to Britain, not England. Mark my words. So I think hopefully it'll work out. But honestly, Britain has got so many problems. We've inherited a disastrous economy after the incredible Brexit-era prime ministers, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, all of these people who just did so much damage to the British economy. That is our particular problem we have to solve. Whether Mr. Trump's interested in helping Britain become great again, make Britain great again, I don't know. We'll see. But Peter Mandleson, certainly in my judgment, and I'm not just a friend, I'm interested in the future of my country. He's the right man at the right time in what's going to be a very difficult job.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Denis Macshane. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.